you just heard a clip of was both the result of and the inspiration for several AC modules for VCV Rack. Today we're going to look at how that track came about and how the AC modules were used to create it. The track started with a basic pad sound from the E340 Cloud Generator module. I was testing out a feature on the Orb SQ VI sequencer that allowed it to reset the drift upon reset. This means that I could get a little bit more predictable drifting to the sequence as it played. As this was a pad sound, I was just going to use the drone output from the Orb SQ to drive the notes in the sequence. I ended up with all three outputs from Orb SQ into a merge module, which there I fed into two different instances of Mercator. I was testing to make sure the polyphonic features were working correctly and to see how they could be used for different purposes. With the first one, I just wanted to compress the 0 to 5 volts coming from Orb SQ down to a 2-octave range, but from -1 volt to +1 volt. And while I didn't initially start with the second instance, I ended up adding it later to use for modulation, taking that same 0 to 5 volts into a 1 to 6 volt range. Each of the Mercators went to their own split modules, where we once again took the drone output into a quantizer. The output from this quantizer is used in 3 different sections of this track, and we'll get to each in turn. Since we started with the pad, we took it into the Cloud Generator module first. I decided to skip using envelope generators, VCAs, or gates, and simply take the output directly into the mixer. I chose to use a ramp LFO to modulate the volume, again taking it through 2 different instances of Mercator. To do this, we used Mercator to map the -5 to 5 volt output of the LFO into a 4 volt to 10 volt range. The mixer's CV input for volume control is a 0 to 10 volt range. I wanted the pad to swell in volume, but I didn't want it to go all the way silent, thus I chose the 4 to 10 volt range. And here's how that sounds. The second instance of Mercator is taking that same ramp LFO and converting it to a 0 to 1.5 volt range to use for modulation. I routed it into the E340's spread CV input, which gives it that warbling sound as the LFO ramps up. We'll give it a listen and then I'll bypass the modulation. The modules from synthesizers.com had just been released, so I wanted to try out the oscillator, and I thought the bassline would be a good spot for that. In my head, I could hear a bassline that just followed along with the same note as the pad. So I took the same drone output from the Orb SQ through a quantizer into PIC 6. When you route a monophonic CV input into PIC 6, it'll output that same CV regardless of what string that step falls on. This made it easy to set up the pattern that I had heard in my head without worrying about what note was going to be played. I went to one of the user slots and programmed this very simple pattern. I also enabled Smart Riff so there'd be some variation. I didn't want my pattern to play every measure, so I set the end of pattern switch to go to a blank pattern and then loop back around. The trigger out from PIC 6 went to a gate envelope generator in VCA, while the CV out went to the synthesizers.com oscillator. We're using the basic sawtooth output and taking it into a filter and then into a chorus, both of those from Surge XT. In the filter, we're taking the same envelope we're using to shape the volume and using it to modulate the cutoff frequency, opening the filter as the envelope opens. We also have a second modulation source coming from the Orb SQ VI. In this case, we're taking the unfiltered step output that's being routed through Mercator and shifted into the 1 to 6 volt range. The nature of this output is giving us a good source of modulation where we can add some character and motion. We're going to open up the resonance and pull back the frequency, all based on those steps. I've also upped the drive of the filter to give the sound a little bit more grunginess. The next part is a high synth sound that's also being driven from the drone output from Orb SQ. We're sending the quantized CV into chord for Roy, which is giving us polyphonic chord data based on that root note. We set chord for Roy into bar chord mode, which is a little bit higher octave. We route the chord CV into pick 6, which is set to one of the standard presets, which is a fairly sparse pattern. We've also enabled Smart Riff and turned the end of pattern switch to move to the next pattern before looping back. We're using a wavetable VCO as our sound source, but we're going to reuse the LFO that we were using to modulate Cloud Generator to modulate the wavetable position. In this case, we're going to be using the sine wave output, which we're taking through another instance of Mercator. This one takes the bipolar output from the LFO and shifts it to be unipolar, between 0 and roughly 7 volts. That allowed us to modulate between a very specific range of the wavetable. We route our VCO through a standard gate, envelope generator, and VCA, and then into a chorus. The second lead sound is a part that inspired new features in 2 different modules. It starts like the first synth part by pulling the drone note from Orb SQ into a chord for Roy to choose a root note. However, I could hear a different kind of chord that I wanted from chord for Roy, and that wasn't something that I could get with the 2 guitar-style chord choices. And this led me to add Piano Man mode, which adds piano-style chords, but with both lower and higher octave notes added in. Pick 6 is again triggering a wavetable VCO, this time using a different wavetable, but using the same LFO to change the wavetable position like we did in our first synth. I'll play this part, but see if you can tell what the other new feature I added was. If you noticed it didn't start playing immediately, that's exactly it. The offset end of pattern option will take whatever the end of pattern switch is set to and do that first before playing the first pattern. In this case, I have it set to a silent bar before looping around, so therefore when we start playing now, it actually plays that silent bar and then the pattern. So now we get this part alternating playing with the bass line. The last synth-related sound are some FM bells. Unlike all the other sounds, however, the notes for the bells derive from the filtered output from acModules. Also of note is that we use a separate LFO to modulate the volume of the bells at the mixer. This lets them come in and out kind of in a drifting fashion. Last but not least are the drums. Here I'm using the Rhythm 13 module, which was actually created specifically because of this track. I couldn't find an existing sequencer that would add variations only to specific tracks and only occasionally. I'm taking the 4 track outputs into the 4 channels of Drum Player Extra, which I'm routing to a submixer, except for the snare, which I'm sending directly to the main mixer so I can add specific effects and EQ. Lastly, I'm modulating the playback speed of the 2 percussion samples. For this, I'm using the unfiltered outputs again from acModules. As I mentioned, I wanted a way to add variation to a sequence, but only on certain tracks. Here I've done that on the snare and the 2 percussion tracks. I also didn't want the variations to happen all the time, so I added the ability to change the frequency of them. Here it's once every third measure. The last thing we'll look at is automation. At the beginning of the song, several channels of our mixer are set to be muted or in a fade state. What we've set up is a way to automate unmuting those tracks, fading them out at the end, and even stopping the clock when we're done. We're doing that with 4 instances of pulses. The first instance handles unmuting the drums and the bass line, and it'll trigger on the 23rd beat coming from the clock. The second instance of pulses is set to output partway through the song on the 56th trigger input. This will unmute the bell sounds. The third instance of pulses is set to handle the very end of the song when we want to fade it out. We do this by sending a trigger to the main channel on the mixer at 220 pulses in. Since the main channel is set to fade, it will start fading out instead of just being muted. And our final instance of pulses is set to actually stop the clock at 245 beats in, which is just enough time for the main channel to have faded out. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown or found it useful, and here's the whole track all together.